Okay, hi everyone. My name is Nick Marshall and I'm the head of exhibitions and programs at the George Eastman Museum. Thank you for joining us for tonight's virtual conversation about the exhibition From an Untouched Landscape with artist James Tylor and guest curator Marina Tyquiengco. The exhibition is Indigenous Exploration of Place, reframing landscape on and near the Kaurna Miyurna Nation's traditional homelands, where Tylor's Kaurna Miyurna people have traced their roots since time immemorial. This is the first solo exhibition of Tylor's work presented in the United States. It opens tomorrow morning at Eastman Museum, and after the show closes here on June 5th, elements of the exhibition will travel to the Kangaroo Aboriginal Art Collection of the University of Virginia, where they will be exhibited from July 7th through June 23rd of 2023. The exhibition at both venues has been very generously supported by the Embassy of Australia, Washington, D.C., and the Honorable Nick Greiner, Australian Consul General, New York. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that the George Eastman Museum resides within the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Onondaga, or the people of the Great Hill, known in English as the Seneca people. Specifically, the museum occupies land ceded in the 1788 Phelps-Gorham Purchase, which was procured under false pretenses, duress, and coercion. We recognize Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. At the George Eastman Museum, we are committed to amplifying and sharing Indigenous stories and work to do so locally and internationally in our exhibitions, collections, programs, and interpretation. I would like to say a thank you to the folks from Ganondagan State Historical Site and local Native communities who were involved in educational components of the exhibition's engagement materials. In a moment, I'll share links to these websites in the chat. Now for a little background info on our speakers. James Tylor is an Australian multidisciplinary contemporary visual artist whose practice explores Australian environment, culture, and social history. He works in mixed media, including photography, video, painting, drawing, sculpture, installation, sound, sense, and food. He was born in Victoria, spent his childhood in New South Wales, and then moved to the Kimberley region in his adolescent years. After training and working as a carpenter in Australia and Denmark, he completed a bachelor's of visual arts and a master's in visual arts and design, both in photography, at the South Australian School of Art, as well as an honors in fine arts and photography at the Tasmanian School of Art. He has researched Indigenous and European colonial history with a focus on South Australia. He is an experienced writer, designer, curator, historian, researcher, art gallery installer, and museum collection conservator. James currently works as a professional visual artist in Canberra. And James is joining us this evening from Australia, where it is, of course, Saturday morning for him. And our other speaker, Marina Tyquiengco, who is the guest curator for the exhibition, is a CHamoru scholar of global Indigenous art with an emphasis on Aboriginal Australian and Native North American art. She received her PhD at the University of Pittsburgh in 2021. She is the inaugural Ellen McColgan Assistant Curator of Native American Art at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. We'd initially planned to have Marina streaming from the gallery this evening, but due to the current circumstances with COVID-19, we weren't able to have Marina travel here, so she's joining us from her home. And instead, I'm streaming from the gallery to give you a little bit of a sneak peek at the show. If you have questions at any point throughout today's talk, please submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the conversation, we'll go through as many of your questions as time permits. The chat function is open. Please feel free to use that to say hello or let us know where you're tuning in from. We are recording today's webinar and we'll be putting it on our YouTube channel in the coming week. So if you'd like to go back and watch again or share with others, you'll be able to access it along with our other webinars and video content through YouTube. And you should be receiving an email if you've attended tonight's program think you had to put your email address in somewhere. You should be receiving that link as soon as it goes online. We have the closed captioning function on Zoom turned on. Hopefully, if you don't want to leave it on, hopefully you should have the ability to turn it off. We had some issues with the last time that we did this. I think we troubleshooted those and resolved them. So hopefully you won't have that anymore. And I do want to note that while Zoom's closed caption is a great feature, it is sometimes not the most accurate at interpretation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Marina to get things started.
Thank you, Nick. Hafa todos. Na'an husi Marina Tyquiengco. So good evening, everyone. My name is Marina Tyquiengco, and I want to recognize as well the Onondaga people and the Wampanoag and Narragansett peoples who have called my current location, Providence, Rhode Island, home since time immemorial. And also just to show the various nations that kind of touch the lands that James is on, I am on, and the museum is on. So the First Nations communities where the artworks that we will discuss tonight were made on the lands of the Kaurna Miyurna, Guditjmara, Bunditj, Wiradjuri, Paramunk, and Ngeri nations in Australia. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and future generations, and extend this respect to the wider Indigenous First Nations communities of North America and Australia. And these maps are from a source called nativeland.ca, which is often managed by non-Indigenous peoples, but it's a really good place to kind of see the diversity of places that you know by non-Indigenous names that are in fact Indigenous places. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. And I would really like to focus on some of the big ideas of this exhibition and also really get into some specific works. James's work is really layered and it starts with place. And so James, I thought that, you know, to get us kind of into the spirit of the many conversations we had working on this exhibition, one of the first things you did is really show me a map. I've been to Australia many times, but I hadn't been to Adelaide specifically. So you really wanted to show me Kaurna Miyurna land, Kaurna and we spent a long time looking kind of specifically at this Google map and then kind of digging into it. So can you tell me, you know, where are the Kaurna Miyurna homelands, Kaurna, and what features really define it? And then I can kind of show a language map that you also shared.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for tuning in and listening. So Kaurna Yata or Kaurna country, which is our nation, it stretches from Kangaroo Island in the south, which is essentially just an island off the Australian coast. And sorry, is that happening at your end?
Oh, is it glitching?
I've lost a map.
Oh, do you want?
Sorry, I don't know what's going on from my side. Sorry. But just to explain a little bit of the Kaurna nation, essentially all of our lands takes up the Adelaide Plains, which is an area that stretches from the north, which is the Flinders Ranges, the very southern part of the Flinders Ranges, and is the western basically floodplains of the Mount Lofty Ranges. And then situated is the South Australian capital, Tandanya in Kaurna language, or Adelaide, which is known by the British name, named after a German queen. In the southern area of the Kaurna nation, there's also Kata or Kangaroo Island, which used to be part of our territory about 10,000 years ago, but because of the last ice age, the area flooded and people were cut off from that area. And so essentially our territory used to extend out into the sea about 10,000 years ago. But today it's just been, since that continental flooding has like pushed it up into the area that is just known as the Adelaide Plains. And so if you've been to Adelaide, it's generally the metropolitan area of Adelaide, as well as if you go up into the north, it's all the farming land in the rolling hills. And so my family comes from the northern part of the Kaurna area, which is around a place called balaclava. And basically my family's been there for 60,000 years and hasn't moved since we arrived. And so, yeah, our family goes back 3,000 generations in that region.
Wow, it's really just so incredible to kind of think about time that far deep, especially when we're thinking about places, countries that have only been around for the last 200 years about. So I think that that's so interesting. And what you're talking about is really up here, correct?
Yeah.
And also these are just, I think that it's also good to kind of share these maps and see that the boundaries are so different when we think about language groups and communities, and also just kind of how many different areas kind of touch, as we were saying, that the regions that are depicted in the photographs are not just Kaurna Miyurna, but just kind of to be able to see the different communities that are kind of all so close together. And so kind of moving on to really get into the work of the exhibition. I think that the series that are in here in this show speak to so many interesting parts of your photographic practice, your kind of historical practice, and also with the kind of plant, tools, weaponry, and the many different things that you're so interested and engaged with. And I think it's interesting to start with maps because they're scaled representations of locations, but there are also so many other ways to think about place and to depict place. And I think the naming of place and titling of it is another really interesting way to think about that. And so these works, and I'm gonna show a specific one in a second, but this series is called, we call this place Kaurna Miyurna, and it shows different sites and their name in the Kaurna Miyurna language. And I wonder if you could just talk about, I'll zoom in on one in a second, but you chose specifically a daguerreotype with an engraved text. And I think that that daguerreotype is, as at this photography museum, so many of the audience may be familiar with that technology. But can you talk a little bit about, why you chose it? These are quite small works, so maybe a little bit about the kind of scale and the process of making a daguerreotype.
Yeah, so this is, Tandanya is the name for Adelaide. So this is a photograph of Karawira Parry, the Torrens River, which was the main water supply that the British basically built Adelaide on, because it was a regular water supply. If you know, Australia is quite arid, and our land sits in this kind of temperate space where because we're kind of in the temperate climate, but we're also in the arid, so we don't have water all year round. So this was the chosen site to situate the capital of South Australia. And Tandanya is our dual name, and it was the name that was there before, and it has really significant cultural story tied to it that we still have. We would have had about 1,000 cultural stories or more, maybe even up to 3,000. But now we only have about 4 cultural stories since colonisation. So we've been heavily impacted. Language has been heavily impacted. So our language was documented in 1840, about 4 years after Adelaide was colonised in 1836. And then the people were removed off the land into missions in Adelaide, and then later moved again to other missions around Port Lincoln, which was 700 kilometres away. And language was then forced to not be spoken. And so by about the 1880s, it wasn't being spoken, but there was still a Kaurna speaker speaking in the 1930s, and then she passed away. It lay dormant or sleeping until it was reawoken in 1989, was the first welcome to country. So our first land acknowledgement done publicly in Kaurna language. That was done by Uncle Lewis O'Brien. And then many people within the Kaurna community have been actively reviving the language. We still have a very fragile language with only 5 fluent speakers and about 150 basically people who identify as speaking Kaurna language. And I'm one of those people, not a fluent speaker, but though I, interact with Kaurna language every day, and I have for about 10 years. And so one of the things that has been really important in our language reclamation is going and getting all the dual place names. Basically, places like Adelaide give you, like, we have a name for this place, so we attribute the old name, and if not, we create new names as a living culture, and we have a dual name, or we go back and anglicised Kaurna names, we basically correct them and make sure that they're spelled correctly and stuff like that. So in this work, it's looking at basically putting our names back into the landscape. So for about 180 years, maybe 150 years in that period, a lot of place names were given English or German names, which were the main two migrants. A little bit of Celtic names were given as well, but it's predominantly English and German in the Adelaide Hills. We have a few German places down on the plains. The Adelaide Hills is paramount, but also similar Kaurna speaking language. So it's been an ongoing process of dual naming these in the last 30 years. Still lots of challenges for our language. And so for me, this work was to honour that last hard 30 years that the Kaurna language community has been putting names back in, but also honouring our ancestors who called these places these names for like 65,000 years. So for me, it's an important level of language, culture, but also activism as well. So yeah, and I mean, like, I do it through the medium of photography because predominantly I'm a photographer. I do other mediums within visual arts. But daguerreotype is kind of the thing that I've like dedicated a good chunk of my life to learning and making work from that medium. So I predominantly do Becquerel, and this is a Becquerel daguerreotype. I have been involved in doing some Mercury ones, but all my photography is Becquerel because it's safer, essentially. So I'm assuming that most people listening would understand the daguerreotype process. But if you don't, it's an image on a polished piece of silver, which makes as a digital reproduction like these images, doesn't really give it justice. It's basically an image on a mirror. So they kind of reflect you and you become part of the image. And so you see yourself within the landscape. I mean, this work is, a lot of my daguerreotypes are for the Australian public. So the idea of doing landscape photography with daguerreotype is to see yourself within that landscape. So from a conceptual perspective, that's why I like to use the process. And also it was developed at about the same time Adelaide was colonised. There's a few daguerreotypes of Kaurna people, very little, and there's almost less than 100 daguerreotypes of the Australian landscape. And generally they only pick them by gum trees. And so gum trees feature a lot in mine as a little kind of reference to that, that daguerreotype photography of Australia. So most of our photography got sent back to England, to the colonial power. So we don't actually have a lot in our own country of them. So it's an interesting process to do. And so there's a lot of relationship between landscape and this medium that I like. So tying them all together feels, for me, it feels they're like intrinsically tied together.
Mm-hmm. And when you visit the exhibition, you'll note that these works are kind of on their own, or they are on their own in a darkened gallery, which is really the best way to see them because they're so particular. And, many of the viewers will probably understand that, or the attendees will understand that, but that these are really small works just because of the technology that you really can kind of look deeply into and are scaled to be personal objects almost as they once were. And I love, this is one that we made a lot of sense to kind of start talking about because of the Tandanya's relationship to Adelaide. But I'm also really struck that this is kind of such a beautiful kind of nature landscape in a place that, in the site that is mostly city. So
yeah, this is to the right of this image. On the A side is a zoo, and to the left is some parklands. And this is probably one of the only tracks of this kind of waterway that isn't developed. I mean, it's mostly parkland, but when you get to the CBD, it's gutted. It's just like grass on either side, skyscrapers on to the right. It's a pretty, and it's very polluted. Like, people stopped drinking it within about 10 years of colonization. It was, and it hasn't really been restored yet. I think there's push to do it, but yeah, it's an interesting developed space. So I try to, in my photography, make like these kind of, hopefully we have an image coming up that I can explain a bit more, but I sometimes delete out some of the built landscape to sort of pay honor to the way that it was prior to colonization.
Mhm. So I think that this, we can, I can ask a question, but I think that it's, as you can see, it's just, these works are so thoughtful, and there's just so many kind of stories of place behind them. So Yarta Kurlanga is one that it really refers back to the cliffs, as we've talked about here. And I think that as you say, like it's hard to see, fully the kind of mirrored quality, but I think you can really get that sense of texture. And also, this is such an interesting, I think we talked a little bit about the complexity of this place name. So can you talk a little bit about this place and the name and its story?
Yeah, so the site's really interesting. So the site that the photo was taken from is, it's got a few names, but the site that it's taken from is, in English, is called Second Valley. And the Kaurna name is Yarta Kurlanga, which is a freshwater place. But the place that you're looking at is Rapid Bay, or Papanyanga, but it can also be called this name. And essentially, it was the site where they were wanting to put Adelaide initially, but they didn't have enough water there. And, the site's really beautiful. There, I mean, today it's just like a industrial harbour with a holiday beach on one side, but there's this like beautiful cave on the other side of this cliff face. Where the photo's taken from, to the left, you can see that rock escarpment. That's where a lot of people jump off to go swimming and stuff like that. So like, for me, I just think about swimming in here, and literally only a few meters to the side is this cliff, this cave that goes inside the cliff, and you can swim into this like darkened cave, and it's really, really beautiful. So for me, it's like I have this personal connection, but it's also this historical one. But the naming is a really interesting process. So the Kaurna naming, or renaming, or basically recorrecting some of the place names. So as I spoke about, some places have Anglo names, some have Anglicized Kaurna names, and some don't have a record of what they were. So this place was recorded as Papanyanga, which is basically the southern place, and it's the southernmost part of the Kaurna region. But that's more of a general term of the area, where this name is a very specific name for a valley that sits, basically you can see all the rocky area, and then there's a rolling hill at the back. If you follow that rolling hill up, there's a massive valley, and this name refers to that valley specifically. And so I've worked with with a historian who's worked with the linguistic community of the Kaurna group to go back and research what the names are through the historical documents, and then figure out what the correct spellings are of names and the correct translations. And so Papanyanga is the one that I would use because it was the most commonly recorded, but he points out that no, that name is a generalized name, and this name is the one for that specific valley. Which, yeah, I mean, I'm still stuck on using the old one. And, you know, most people who are English spoken will call this place Rapid Bay. So in many ways, there's like 3 names for this place. And there's also Nunga names because it's getting very close to the Nunga border, which is another language group that speaks a completely different language. So the southern languages that go from south to the east coast of Australia have a completely different language structure. It's almost like the Germanic languages and the Latin languages in Europe. We have a very similar structure where the languages, the Kaurna language belongs to the northern and the desert languages, where the east coast languages, Nunga, which is on our border, speak another. So we can tell our languages quite easily apart because they're so different. And sometimes we get Nunga names coming up onto, Nunga names coming up onto Kaurna land. So we've got a lot of dynamics going on with all these different cultures that have contributed to naming of these places.
Thanks, James. And this is one that we've talked about a lot, Garta or Kangaroo Island. And I think this was one to me when we were thinking about the series that was so important. So can you tell us a little bit about Garta? Yeah,
so Garta is one of the Kaurna names for the island. We also have Pindinyanka, the place of the dead. I call it the long form, generally Karta Padinga. And you'll see in the series that there's a name that I have had both names present, but then when I write about it, I generally use both names because we have strangely 2 names. And then this is an interesting place. So it's about 12,500 years ago, the Ice Age started to end. And then because of all the melt, the sea levels rose and cut off this and made it an island, because beforehand it was like a mountain. And it would have belonged to probably Peramang people, which are the people in the Adelaide Hills. So it's an extension of their mountain range. But basically the northern side of the watershed belonged to Kaurna. And then that went halfway along the northern side. Then the southern side was of the watershed was Nunga. And then the far western side was Bangala. And then the northwestern side belonged to Narunga people. So it's like there's about 5 people who've invested cultural histories with this place. And so in that 10,000 years, people abandoned the island because of basically, you can live on the island. There is enough resources there to sustain a population, but the social connectiveness of Aboriginal cultures, like we are so connected to our neighbours, the interrelationships between us, you know, like knowing people's families, kinship systems, all of those things meant that people didn't want to live in an isolated island. Like Kangaroo Island, which is about 100 kilometres long by 50 kilometres wide. So it's big enough, you know, people live there now quite happily. But there's a ferry system that connects it. There's about 12 kilometres, which I think is about 10 miles of water between. So it is quite a treacherous channel to cross. You can do it in a boat, do it in a canoe, you can swim it. We have some pretty horrors colonial stories of Aboriginal women being taken as slaves to the island and then trying to swim back the 15 kilometres across the water to get away. But basically no one had lived there for about 10,000 years. And so we call it the island, like the other name is Pindinya, the island of the dead. And so people used to do a burial practice facing people towards this in their graves. And so we have a connection to the island because of that, and obviously people facing their ancestors to the island was a really important connection to our ancestral land, one of our ancestral lands. So it's a really interesting space where it's got a very interesting colonial history. It was colonized by, so Aboriginal people were there first, and we still have a long connection with our naming and cultural stories. But it was colonized by the American whalers and sealers first, who stayed there for about 6 months. And then later by English and French whalers and sealers. And then that happened over about a 25-year period. And then it was colonized by the British. And then they set up their first capital and then moved it to Adelaide. So like the island has a very treacherous history, has a history of Aboriginal slavery in that whaling period. And then it has like this long history. And then it's like, you know, and then more recently it has catastrophic bushfires that have plagued the island. And yeah, it's a very beautiful place. And if you can see just above the T, there's a place where there's these stones that are arranged in a specific way, which is very, like it's a place that's said to be really important in the Pindinyanka story of the Island of the Dead, like an ancestor goes up into the sky from there. And it's just a beautiful, they call it remarkable rocks in English because it is remarkable. And so that features in here as a little kind of signifier to that story.
Thanks, James. So I think there's, as you can see, there's just so many really interesting stories of place that each of these images touches, and the different communities and the histories. But I feel like we maybe haven't really talked about the way that you take these photographs. And I think it's really striking kind of the different vantage points that seem to be depicted. So I wonder if there's, you know, how do you think about the way that you're shooting? How do you think about kind of the way that you're delineating the places that you show, and kind of from what points you shoot them when you're thinking of this series? Is it kind of, it seems like it's pretty different based on each place where you're looking down.
Yeah, well, most places that I visit, obviously, like I want to make them look pretty, so it's always the prettiest site, but they also have to have like that significant like cultural story. Like these places have names, and those names refer to specifics. So there's two photographs in this, like for this photograph, and there's another one, and both of them refer to the same place. And so so Mirika, the first part refers to crying, and then the second part is a suffix that means place. So this is at the crying place, where like essentially there's many ways that name is interpreted about this history, but there is a story, one of our best songlines of this place, which is like a songline's like a story that plays out through the landscape, and it's how we record our history. So as an oral history, you retract these stories once a year, referring to specific places along the track. And that's done by a specific family within a language group, or in a clan in a language group. And so they hold on to these stories and they recite them, and they've been handed down for thousands of years. We don't know exactly how old the story is of Traborki. So this story has to be roughly between 9,000 and 1,000 years ago. Sometime in that space, we know the story was like the event happened, and the story's been playing out and been handed down generations and generations. Anyway, Mirika refers to a part of the story where the story's about this guy who spears a emu, and he was the first person to see the emu, so he had the right to spear it. But as he was cooking it in the ground, he like speared the ground to let the steam out and to see if the emu was fully cooked. And as the steam came up, it blinded him, and two of his cousins basically snuck up and killed him, and then took the emu because they wanted the food. Anyway, his uncle then like goes on this sort of like, it's not a retribution, but we call it, it's like an inquest into, there's a very specific practice of inquiring when someone passes away to track down who the culprit was. And in this case, it was two of his nephews, and his other nephew had died. He basically carries the body around trying to figure out who it is. Anyway, the funeral practice happens through almost like a 70-kilometer area. And in one of the places, he cries, and he cries in this specific spot, Mirika, where you can find these little fresh water pools that like come up. So this is quite an arid area of the Adelaide Plains, and it's up against the sea. There isn't very many running creeks, but there's these little freshwater things, and they bubble up in a just like only in an area maybe about as big as what I'm showing you now, like less than like a foot or like half a meter. Anyway, it's these freshwater pools are representing his crying. So they play a specific role in where you take the photos from. But this is also a very important ochre site. So there's lots of stories that are overlaid. So when I take a photo, I try to capture the best part of telling those stories. So like I use my techniques as a photographer to capture the images, but they are very specific geographical places that have these stories. I should point out that I take these photographs are all taken on my iPhone, and then I printed them onto the daguerreotype. So it's an interesting intervention that I've used because it's a bit safer as actually like physically as a maker. The daguerreotype process is quite toxic and quite dangerous, using mercury to get the same tones. So like if you put my daguerreotypes up against a mercury one, particularly my portrait is very clear. They're very close in tonal range from a in-camera shot to one of my ones that I've taken the photo digitally, edited it to a point where I pull out as many tones as I can get it very close to the daguerreotype, the mercury process in its tones. The tones are different, like you get blue skies in the daguerreotype and in the shadows, and then you get this frosted creamy color in the highlights, where in the mercury process, they flip and you get the vivid blues in the other areas. And so like you can physically see the difference between the process, but the technique is shift. This is a good one because you can see the tonal shift in the Becquerel method. But it also allows me, if I shoot it on my phone, I can shoot it in the field without taking equipment out. I can edit it, make a better picture later, but still create that image and that atmosphere of like viewing this like a lot of it is about viewing this in the 19th century almost and seeing it from that perspective. And as I was saying, that there is one where I've deleted out. In the background of this image, you can see that there's just a tree line. I've had to digitally alter that image because it is actually a cityscape in the background. Like it's all housing, it's just suburbia. And this is just a national park that sits within that space. And so, yeah, I've had to alter it to make it kind of resemble what it would have looked like in the 1840s. I mean, in the 1840s, it wouldn't have been as devegetated as this, but yeah, I try to. It's a whole lot of playing around with like technologies that we have now to enhance those technologies from the 19th century, but also deleting it like the present time and making it look more like the past. So it's a little bit of an illusion. Yeah, I don't know what to make of it, but that I just do that because I think it's like it pays homage to what it was like pre-colonial.
I think it's so interesting, and I think that that's something that's kind of always really fascinating about your practice. And now we're in the gallery again where Nick is now, but that kind of move between technologies and through technologies is I think such an interesting characteristic of your work. And so this is removed scenes and vanished scenes, both parts of From an Untouched Landscape, the larger series of your work from 2018 that you kind of spent a lot of time working on, and also includes deleted scenes from an Untouched Landscape, which are all these really fabulous carved works. And I think that I just really love the way that they're all kind of installed together. And I have a lot, there's so much to say about these different sites, but I wonder if maybe we could kind of go big again and think about, going off that idea of altering the landscape to make it look more like the 1840s, and then, taking that 1840s technology from taking the iPhone back to the 1840s technology to print on the daguerreotypes. What does it mean for a landscape to be untouched? And I also think that maybe, because of your interest in history, I wonder if you agree that the framing of untouched has really persisted in a lot of places, a lot of colonized places. And I wonder if you have any thoughts to like maybe why that idea of like coming upon untouched landscape that is Indigenous landscape that has been altered by the people there, why that framing persists, and kind of what this idea means to you.
Yeah, I guess like untouched is like for me is a very specific response, but it does seem to exist within European colonies in like the non-European countries. So it's a very colonial term about ownership of those lands and like denying the histories of Indigenous peoples. And I feel like it plays out very like it happens in all parts of like the British colonies. So, you know, the US, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the other islands within the Pacific that the British have occupied. And Australia, it seems to be very like the idea that Australia was colonized on this idea of terra nullius, no person's land, has played out through like the way that history is told or the language that we use around it. And one of these terms that I came across, so like I grew up I had a privileged but unprivileged upbringing in the sense that like I grew up in around towns that were majority Aboriginal and just like white Australian, so British Australian, which was about 50-50 in the places that I grew up. And it wasn't until I moved to Adelaide in my adult life that I started to get challenged by being in spaces that are majority only like white, I guess. And so like for a lot of my upbringing, these places are these dynamic spaces where I know the Aboriginal history because Aboriginal people are there telling you orally, but then when you're at school, you're being told only the British history, and it's this like weird divide. And when you step out of those spaces into cities, in a lot of metropolitan places in Australia, the history just changes and it becomes only white. And so like, as an Aboriginal person from a capital city, you know, like my nation was colonized by the British, like it was the first place in South Australia to be colonized. And, you know, 1 million people live on our land. And, you know, like when we're talking about this language, you know, only 5 fluent speakers and about 150 like people who identify as Kaurna speakers, there's a potential of 1 million people speaking our language, but then that million speaks English. And so the history is told through that space. And so this idea of untouched starts to come in from this kind of Western perspective of these spaces. And when I was studying in Tasmania, there's an emphasis on landscape photography specifically because they have this, you know, like Tasmania is so beautiful. And it's this space that Palawa people lived and called the island Latrawina. And it's a space where the Tasmanian community has had some of the worst genocide in the world, basically. Like the British, a population of about 20,000 people or more were massacred down to most Tasmanians today. The population is now around 18 to 20,000 people have managed to get reclaim their space and their land, which is an incredible feat, given that most people can only trace their family to 5 specific families that stayed refuged with the whalers and sealers in that period of like the 1820s and 40s, have managed to reclaim those spaces. But this idea of this untouched Tasmania still existed. And every time I was in a lecture, everyone was going like, oh, you know, Aboriginal people were here. Like they would say this untouched landscape, and then they would have to like, they'd stumble for a second and go, oh, but you know, like obviously Palawa people were here before. And there's 2 things playing out. There's like this untouched space fits into this notion of terra nullius, which has been overturned in court by Eddie Mabo, who basically put in the 90s, put in place that, you know, Aboriginal people own these tracts of land for thousands and thousands of years. And that we own these spaces, and this idea of terra nullius never existed. Aboriginal people occupy these spaces and use these lands in a very structured way. Like the Kaurna nation, you could figure out exactly where our nation ends based on like specific geographical locations. And so this notion of untouched is like drawing on that idea of untouched, but it's kind of like tongue in cheek, but it's also, it's not funny though, you know, like it is not funny. But it is playing in that space of like, we were removed from that space to create this idea of, you know, like create this idea of British nationalism in Australia. And so like in these spaces and in these photographs, I've either deleted Aboriginal spaces or alluded to spaces or deleted specific Western sites as a little bit of a, you know, like taking them out. But how I've deleted them is I did wet plate in that same period as I was in Tasmania studying. I did wet plate, and one of them was ambrotype. And a technique in the ambrotype is to take black velvet and put it behind a piece of glass to create the black and white image. And the idea of using velvet, it absorbs light better than anything else. And so what I did is I took these photos either on film or digital, printed them digitally, and then cut a hole in the image and then made a void behind. And that void is the removal of those spaces. And it basically, what it does is it takes part of the image out, and you can't ever ascertain what was in that image again. And that feeling was what I was trying to convey. Like as an Aboriginal person, when those histories are removed and there's no information left, the item in the landscape's been removed, as well as the cultural information because of the colonization process has been removed. I wanted to create that feeling for the viewer of never being able to ascertain that loss. And so these ideas, these holes, is one, the removal, talking about this idea of creating untouched by physically removing these spaces and deleting these histories. And so they're quite, you know, like they're quite challenging images when you think about what they are. And these places are significant, like various ones are on Kangaroo Island, some are on Gunditjmara country where they had some of the most horrendous frontier violence in the whole of Australia, where there was indiscriminately killing, wars that weren't really documented in Australian history. Well, they are documented, but they're not told in the contemporary telling of Australian history. They're like well documented in the colonial papers. But so yeah, it's just talking to that, I guess.
Yeah, and I think so. We have some really amazing images and stories that I think I touched on more because we've talked about them in the catalog, and there's also, you know, so much great information that you have in all these works. But I wonder if maybe before we move to Q&A, we can just talk a little bit about the carving element of your practice. And I think also from these, so this is a slide that has, you know, a few kind of broadly South Australian Aboriginal objects, but you also include, you know, the cross that we saw, different kinds of pistols from the area. And I find it so fascinating that it's all timber and black paint, kind of regardless of if they're colonial weapons or Aboriginal weapons. So I'd love for you to talk about, you know, how you selected what you were carving and the kind of significance of including both of, you know, or many backgrounds of objects, right, with the colonial and the Aboriginal, and making them from the same material.
Yeah, well, the works in this exhibition specifically, so I've made like 4 bodies of work across this, like titled From an Untouched Landscape, but this specific, like, I guess, curatorial installation was done originally with my friend Hayley Miller Baker, who she's Gunditjmara from Western Victoria, and we're collaborating between them, where I have my non-Indigenous ancestors on my dad's side were some of the first colonists in that space, as well as my Aboriginal family and white colonial family from Adelaide. And so I married those images together. So there's a few images from South Australia as well as Western Victoria. And we married them up because there's this, like one of the main threads that ties us together is the whaling stories. And so in that colonial frontier space is this kind of weird history of these, like, of the whaling industry. And the whaling industry ties a lot of our communities together, Aboriginal communities together, but it's almost like an untold part of history in Australia. Like, whaling, because Australia has such a staunch like international point about whaling, you know, pressuring Japan not to whale in the Pacific. But we have a hideous whaling history. Like, one of my ancestors has been attributed to killing more whales than any human being on the planet. And so, like, I trace my family to these whalers. But these whalers are really interesting. They range from hideous practices of kidnapping Aboriginal people to marrying Aboriginal people and being the ones that basically helped Aboriginal people on the frontier. So they just like these, they connect us in such a weird way. They also have their own deleted histories because they couldn't read and write. So their histories are only recorded in like 1 or 2 books in the whole of British literature. You know, like there's the American story. So a lot of them are operating were American whalers leaving the US, like the new formed United States, coming out and occupying like the southern part of Australia, as well as the French and the British. So it was an interesting area, but they were picking up Aboriginal men to work on the boats, but kidnapping Aboriginal women to like basically forage food for them, sex slaves. Like, it was a horrendous part of our history, but it's such a pivotal point in the colonial process that is underlooked. And so, like, as a person from these backgrounds, I wanted to draw on them. So the artifacts are talking about, one, frontier violence, but also the whalers, but also the Aboriginal history, and they've all been deleted from the national narrative, like the Australian national narrative. And it's just a really kind of, like, I don't know, like, I take a non-biased, like, I am emotionally connected to this and I'm genetically connected to these spaces. And so it's like, it's a very interesting space where I try to step back away from it to present something for people to, you know, like, these are our cultural stories, good and bad. And I try to take a non-biased point on them. They are horrible histories. But yeah, so I black them out because it's this idea of erasure, but there's also this idea of mixing. And like, as a person with multicultural heritage, it's, you know, like, it is important to tell those stories, even if in the national narrative they don't fit. And so, like, it's almost like repatriating our histories, bringing together. There's spaces I don't really understand 100%. That's why I explore them. And for me and Hayley, we wanted to bring our works together and talk about this space that we knew. Like, there's so many amazing shifts that have come from collaborating with Hayley in this installation. So the works that the Indigenous artifacts are generic ones, in the sense that they're ones that both Gunditj and Kaurna have. So like, we have lots of artifacts that just belong to our communities and our communities only. And then we have these ones that sort of sit in this space where lots of communities use these specific items. And so I've made the South Australian versions of the ones that are generic to talk about the relationship between them. And it was a discussion that me and Hayley had. I could not make the Gunditj Murra ones, like, culturally it's taboo. It's also even more taboo that my family was colonial in that space. So like, for an Aboriginal person who came from that white space to be making Gunditj Murra artifacts would have been completely inappropriate. So I made Kaurna ones that both we could share. So it had that aesthetic, and it was a decision that me and Hayley made to, because Hayley doesn't make artifacts. So she was like, you have to fill this gap. And then the colonial artifacts reference to the frontier violence. So the cross in the background, you know, and the muskets that a lot of the whalers and stuff use and were used on the frontier. So like, yeah, they work as visual aids to enhance the images, give a presentation of what could be deleted and what stories could be deleted from those images. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that was fantastic, James. And I think that it's such an important point that that a lot of Indigenous people have multicultural or mixed backgrounds, and that it's very possible to be deeply involved in your one's, you know, particular Indigenous heritage, but also acknowledge the kind of multiplicity and colonial background, because that's how many Indigenous people survived, is by mixing and by, you know.
Yeah, and it's such a dynamic space. Like, I think about, because where a lot of the photographs are taken, the community is small. Like, I mean, like Narrawong. So like, to go back to that image of the wharf that was going out to sea, that is like one of the most significant Victorian massacre sites, which that was built, potentially that wharf for the whaling was built by some of my ancestors. And we know people who descend from the other side of that, and they're friends of ours. Like, and we've grown up around families, like we've all grown up together around each other. And so like, it's hard to take our historical events, which, you know, they shape our lives as Aboriginal people. You have disadvantage because of colonialism, but you still have to co-live with everybody, and we're all like interwoven, married, have these relationships and these spaces and these shared histories. And it's such a complicated space. Like, I can't even, like, these don't solve any problems by telling them, they just tell the histories. But they're like, you can't, like, some people are like, I hate the whalers, right? Like, personally, but I know Aboriginal people who love the whalers, and it's offensive for me to say that to them, and I understand why. But because my notion of whalers are that they were horrible people, you know, they were land stealers and rapists and like all sorts, and they were colonists, but to some people, they were the ones who saved their family. So like, it's just like the histories are dynamic, you know, like people have interrelated, like are married together. It's just like, because the communities are so small in Australia, it's just, they're not simple stories, and they're very complex, and our histories are so intertwined. It's like, yeah, it's a really complicated one. Like, and I don't think there's any short answers to like these spaces and the stories and the relationships. Like, it's just, yeah, like some of the conversations that have come about because of collaborating with Hayley and talking about these histories, it's like, yeah, it's like there's no easy answer to any of it. Like, I found out that I was related to some of the first colonists in Victoria, and I like didn't even know that. And like, it should have been so obvious. Like, my family farm was on their property, you know, that they first stole. And it's like, I should have known, but I didn't. And our family never were proud about it. It was so weird. And it's like, and it only came about by like working with Hayley to bring out these stories. And before that, I was just like an Aboriginal kid in that space. So it was a really weird thing. And then like track my family back to the, you know, the development of Victoria as a colonial state. And it's like, they're very weird. Like, I can't even really ascertain it. Like, it makes me feel sick in the stomach. I don't ever feel proud. But I feel connected in a way. Like, if I take the emotion of good and bad out of it, I have like such connections to these spaces. But if I start putting the like cultural and historical stuff on top of it, then I start to get these like conflictive things. But when I just engage with the histories, they're just rich. Like, they're rich stories. They're interesting. They're important. They're like, yeah, it's such a, yeah, for me, they're really important stories. Yeah, I could waft on about it forever, so I won't.
Well, so we have a few minutes left, James and Marina. If anybody has any questions for either James or Marina, please submit them through the Q&A now. We'll take a few minutes and start going over those. James, kind of maybe related to what you were just talking about, that like one of the things that I have kind of been unsure, I don't want to say struggle, but I've been unsure of is whether I refer to them as weapons or tools or what exactly to call them. And I think that I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, if that's maybe kind of reflected in like as you're saying, like even within your community, like there's different interpretations of like whaling, and that some of these things might be seen as tools versus seeing them as weapons. So I don't know if that's kind of, if you like that kind of like kind of uncertainty or that tension between.
Well, I think they're complex, right? Like, I think, so there's a lot of debate about the language that we use around Indigenous artifacts specifically. And I mean, these conversations really need to be having around like the British colonial objects in Australia as well. Like, what do we call them? So currently the most favored thing is calling them belongings because they belong to us. And I think that's a really beautiful thing to call like our, like it's really hard because there's so many different aspects. Like if you're not from the arts background, they're tools, they're weapons, right? Like you don't really see them in any other way. You come in it from art, they're artifacts or they're objects or they're like these other languages. And they have like loaded language behind them. I think they are mixed up. Like I don't think like things just mean different things to different people. I think is the short dismissive answer. But I think like that is kind of true. It's like in many of these histories that I'm like telling to move away from the object, there's a notion of like a colonial space, a post-colonial space, and a decolonial space. And people like want these labels for specific things to be hard and fast. Like Aboriginal people are decolonizing things whilst like these things are post-colonial because they come after colonial, but then Aboriginal people are like, no, these are colonial spaces. But they're all of these things all at one time. Like these are like, I try to move away from the word of artifact. Probably is the one term I probably wouldn't use for these because I find artifact is anthropological and a museum thing. I feel like the objects is problematic too, but it's okay. But I think belongings is probably the most appropriate. But I think that they're all of those things at the same time, even if we don't like the terminology around them. And I think these are dynamic things that are happening. Like it's hard to think about these ideas in a Western idea of like art history because things happen in a linear time. They're given very specific terms for very specific outcomes. And they different points from different backgrounds. But from an Indigenous perspective, we think about history as ongoing. Like, so an Aboriginal idea of like songlines is we repeat histories every year and they're playing out and they inform like what's happening in the current situation to inform the future. And so like they're ongoing like all the time. So like these historical events in these images are playing out now in the way that we engage with our communities, disadvantage in these communities, and they will inform the way that we go forward in these spaces too. So like it's like a dynamics. And I think in the object space, it's the same thing. Like the terminology around them will mean different things at different times, but they'll also mean different things in the future as well, and the way that we interpret our own histories. And I mean, like in Australia, people like things very black and white. So like these are Aboriginal and these are like Australian. And Australian is like this notion of British Australian. And it's been watered down with migrant histories and then Aboriginal histories coming in, and Australia's this like dynamic multicultural space. So when I think about Australia, I think about the place and the people in it. I don't think about it belonging to one ethnicity or another cultural group. I think about it as a dynamic space. And so I think the same applies for the objects, the histories and the photographs and the places depicted. These are like dynamic, and I don't think there's any one easy answer to any of these questions. I think they only pose more questions. But yeah, they just mean different things. It's perspective point, right? Like, yeah.
So a question just came in. James, your work and stories are complex and fascinating on so many levels. What are some of the reactions you've had to your work from the Aboriginal and other communities in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, most people have been pretty, like, there's been pretty positive. I mean, they're challenging histories. But yeah, I think most people are wanting to, like, I think a thing that's happening at the moment, which just happens to be like, I'm present in a very interesting time in history in Australia, where like people, like we still have like redneck racists in like many of these spaces, but they're a minority. And I think the vast majority of Australians are trying to grapple these histories. I think Aboriginal people are on the front foot on this because we've, educated in two worlds. So we've been like navigating this space for a long time, been learning about it unofficially out of school, like by the community telling you about these histories, about massacres, where I think the non-Indigenous space is only starting to really grapple with these since like 88 from the bicentennial. And it's really ramped up in the last like 5 years that people want to engage with these. So I think largely it's been positive. I think people want hard answers, but I don't think there's any one hard answer. And I don't think there's any like I think our relationships become more complex, and hopefully they move to something where our relationships are stronger. I don't know if they're always necessarily going to be easy relationships. I think we're quite scarred by what happened 5 or 6 generations ago, sometimes 7 generations, but it's not that long ago. Like there's still people who know people who saw things on the frontier, you know, like a grandparent who knew a grandparent who did something on the frontier. Like it can be sometimes only 2 generations. So like for us, it's still pretty like, you know, it's still pretty raw for us. Some people say it's a long time ago, but it really isn't. And, you know, like some people still have like such privilege and advantage and still own the tracts of land that their family took. And then there's like lots of Aboriginal people don't even own their own house. So like, it's gonna be like, I think it plays out. I think it's very challenging like topics for the present. But I think all it does is enrich our relationships. Doesn't necessarily mean that these histories become easier. I think they become easier when we all talk about them, but they're like, it's never going to be like hunky-dory. It's not like, it's never going to be like happy, you know, like these histories are going to be hard, but I think they're there, they teach us something. And I think that's probably the most important thing. So I think most people receive them as like important, I guess.
Yeah. So kind of, I guess, thinking like to the future and thinking about how your work can impact future generations and continue to tell these stories, you know, a question came in about the lifespan of daguerreotypes. And I think particularly maybe like the process that you use. Is there anything that you're aware of in terms of the longevity of the work that you're making, or particularly the daguerreotypes?
Yeah, I think just on the materiality of the daguerreotypes. So like historical daguerreotypes were made pretty roughly, right? Like they were slapped together by like people working with like really basic understanding of the chemistry and the physics of daguerreotypes. So like they tarnish, they degrade over time. But we've learned a lot in the last, like, I think it's what, 180 years about the, like how daguerreotypes work. So how we make them now, and I say that collectively because like there's a massive daguerreotype contemporary community that do it. And so like, I think like our technology around it now means that they're very stable. Like they're gold gilded, they're made sure they're washed in distilled water, they're super clean, they're sealed up, they're behind museum glass that has UV protection. You know, all the material that goes into them is archival. So their longevity will be longer than what has been around. I mean, they're always going to be a bit vulnerable because they're silver. But I think, yeah, and I mean, I don't know where, like these histories are interesting. The histories will be there. And I think there's, you know, there's lots of Australians telling these stories, which will hold these longevity and the narratives that are playing out in my work. Like, I'm not the only person telling these stories, you know, like it's in literature, if it's in like oral histories, if it's on guided tours, or like even just people having conversations about history with their grandparents over coffee or tea, you know, like I think at the end of the day, like these histories are still being told in informal ways or informal ways. I think that like the longevity of this will like only strengthen over time. As for daguerreotypes, I don't know, like I'll leave that down to the people who do like archiving. Like I don't do archiving of daguerreotypes. I like more look at working in spaces around like art conservation. So I don't like, which does encompass photography, but I'm not photography specific. I'm more like Aboriginal like artifacts and belongings. Like I'm in that space of museum collections is where I've worked. In the space of photography, I don't know. So that's a better, I think you'd be better at answering that, Nick, to be honest.
Well, no, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, they certainly traditionally have had a history of degrading over time, and that they are very vulnerable objects. And a lot of care needs to be taken to preserve them. And that is something that we focus on a lot here. And there are many people here that could speak a lot better about that than I could. Our conservation team, our collections managers and curators who are making that a big priority for them. But I think we've got to wrap things up here. I apologize if we weren't able to get to anyone's questions, but we do hope that you're able to come in and see the exhibition if you're in the area. I just kind of to let you know, we are open. We do require masks at all times in the museum, and we will be doing so for the foreseeable future. But please come and join us. We're trying to make it as safe a place as possible. And one thing I do want to note is that, you know, I think seeing this work in person, that James talked a little bit about that black void earlier. Like, you really don't get a sense of that and seeing them as digital images on a screen. And it hit, I know it hit me a lot harder. And I think listening here and having conversations with some of my colleagues, like, we didn't expect, there's actually space, there's depth in those. And it really creates this like totally different viewing experience, and you experience them in a different spatial way. And for that, I would encourage anybody to come in and have that experience with these works. And certainly the daguerreotypes sitting in that room, it has a very powerful feeling in it being in that darkened space with the patterns and the daguerreotypes. So would definitely encourage everyone to come in. I think it was mentioned briefly, there is a great catalog that is for free. If you come into the gallery, they'll be available. Marina has a great essay in here. This was put together by Kangaroo, and they'll have this as well at their location. But come in, check out the show, grab the catalog, and thank you all so much. Marina and James, I'll give you the last couple words here.
Well, I'll give James the last word, but just thank you so much, Nick, and thank you for the great questions. I haven't seen anything in the chat, but I'm sure that they're all really great comments as well. And it's been such a pleasure to work on the show, to learn more about this region that I didn't know as much about in Australia, and especially to work with James and Nick. So thank you both. Sijus Mase.
Yeah, thank you for like listening into the talk, and I hope you get to see the exhibition in flesh. I won't, because I don't get the chance to travel across for this exhibition, so please enjoy it, because I won't get to see it. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you both. Thank you all for joining. Look out for the link, and if you'd like to go back and rewatch or share. Have a nice weekend, everybody.